Welcome to another edition of H. Poll's soon-to-be legendary uh, historiography podcast, whatever we want to call this, called Comps List Radio. As we mentioned in our first episode, our goal is to discuss and analyze some of the classics of the American political history field in order to make it a little more approachable and a little easier for graduate students going through comps and maybe scholars who are well past that, who are looking to re-engage with some works that maybe they read during their comps, but have kind of forgotten most of why they were important. Today, I'm joined once again by my co-host, Marie Totten at the University of Central Arkansas. Marie, you're going through a deep freeze there in Conway, Arkansas. Can you give everybody an update on how you're doing?
Yes, we're surviving, but I can tell you Arkansas is not prepared for this type of freeze, especially not snow-packed ice. So we're all inside, working from home this week, but doing well overall.
Well, that's good. Again, glad to hear that you're inside, food's in the fridge, and the
Yes.
furnace is working. So that's what matters.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
I'm here in Phoenix, Arizona in the wintertime where I don't have to worry about things like that. So
Very lucky.
very, very lucky. Today we're going to look at a classic of the New Deal literature. Ellis Hawley's Monopoly and the Problem of, the New Deal and the Problem of Monopoly. Want to get that right. And I love the subtitle. It's a study in economic ambivalence.
Yes.
For those who do political history, those who do policy history, this absolutely is a classic. And one that gets and Ellis Hawley as a scholar gets referenced a lot. But I'm not sure how many people actually read his books on comps lists anymore. And so hopefully this is an opportunity to at least familiarize yourself with Hawley's work. I know this was really great for me. I did not have Hawley on my comps list. I don't know. Marie, did you?
No, I didn't. I had some of the works influenced by Hawley, which I think is probably where a lot of our listeners are coming from, but I did not have Hawley specifically.
Okay, can you talk maybe a little bit about some of the works that were influenced by Hawley that you had on your comps list?
Yes, the one I kept coming back to throughout this period is Ira Katznelson, Fear Itself. So maybe more indirectly, but still talking, and we'll get into all of this when we talk about Hawley specifically, but talking about how that New Deal coalition, once it's formed, it's almost already, like, the inconsistencies are there and it's already ready to fracture. And Katznelson looks at this from a different angle than Hawley, not the economic angle, but more the social justice, racial angle in his work. But still, that idea, building on Hawley's idea that the inconsistencies are built into the coalition.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think this is the one thing that emerges from Hawley's work is just how factional the New Deal is.
Right. Exactly.
And wildly unwieldy.
Yes, on purpose.
I mean,
by design.
Yeah, on purpose, or at least better than, or at least, maybe chosen from an unattractive menu of alternatives.
Right. Yes, that's a way to put it for sure.
So I do want to just touch base maybe on some books again, like some books that were influenced by Hawley that you've that listeners may have encountered. Marie, are there any others that leap to mind?
There are a few. Alan Brinkley's work definitely comes to mind. But any scholar who looks at the New Deal from this angle, that the inconsistencies aren't a problem and that the New Deal is much more nuanced than those first schools look at within the historiography, is going to have they're going to be influenced by Hawley here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, this book, man. I mean, I did a dissertation on the New Deal, and I know I breezed through parts of this book in the process of writing it. Not entirely on the New Deal. The New Deal was an aspect of my dissertation, and I really wish that I'd read this book in like really in depth. So this is my way of telling scholars that you're listening. If you're writing a dissertation or you're writing a book on the New Deal where the New Deal plays a major role, this 1 hour podcast is probably not going to be enough for you.
Right.
I think you need to read this book.
Yeah, there's just so much in it. I mean, so much we're not going to be able to cover. But he really goes through those New Deal programs and the different factions of the coalition. I mean, absolutely, I agree with you. Read it.
Yeah.
Listen to us first, but then read the podcast or then read the book.
I think that's good. And then read the book and tell us why we're wrong in our interpretation of everything.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I mean, anyway, if you're not necessarily a scholar of the New Deal and you're just, maybe the New Deal sort of maybe a little bit outside of your research area, or you teach the New Deal, or you teach the second half of the survey, or you're working somewhere in 20th century politics, the podcast will probably be enough. But if you are researching the New Deal and you're writing on the New Deal, I cannot recommend enough setting time aside and actually reading this book.
Absolutely.
Okay, Marie, we're gonna switch chairs here for a second. I interrogated you last week, which I'm usually more comfortable doing. But I'm gonna put you in the interrogator's chair here for a minute, or for a while, and let you pilot this ship.
That sounds good. So I want to start first with, who is Ellis Hawley? So we've established this as a foundational text, American political economy, but who is this man?
Hawley is a really interesting figure in American history. This book is the book that emerges from his dissertation. This was his dissertation. He was teaching at at North Texas State University at the time when he wrote this. He ended up at the University of Iowa for most of his career. He was a Western scholar, a Midwestern scholar. He had opportunities to go to the East Coast, places like Ivy League universities. He chose to stay in Iowa, North Texas, and then Iowa for many reasons. But that being in Iowa gave him regular access to the Hoover archives. And so might be the most esteemed historian to really know the Hoover archives. And so while this book relies on the Hoover archives a little bit, it's his later work that really engages with Hoover. And if you are a student of Hoover, of 1920s politics, but particularly Herbert Hoover and his era, you will know your views are shaped by Ellis Hawley, whether you know it or not. So this book is actually, of the 1930s. It's not really a Herbert Hoover book, but maybe the work that he becomes more known for actually is his work on Herbert Hoover and his time spent in the Hoover archives. He passed away back in 20. He passed away about 6 years ago, 2019.
Right, 2020, yeah, and has quite the academic lineage too. When I was looking through his, learning more about Hawley as I was reading this, I was, 19 advisees. 10 of those advisees went on to get their dissertations published as major works in the field. So very impressive there. I was also surprised at the connections between Hawley and Woodward. And I don't think we did this on purpose, but they had the same advisor. And I was very interested. Bill was both of their advisors. So I was very interested in that. They both fought in the military, Woodward in World War One and Hawley in Korea. But just those, both in their 30s when they write these foundational texts. And so I was surprised there that overlap, but around the same. I mean, they're writing around the same time period, Woodward a little earlier. But we see even those connections among these historians themselves.
Yeah, well, yeah, I didn't. It didn't actually register that Beale was both that Howard Beale was both of their supervisor. That's amazing. Uh,
I thought so too. So they bring in, I mean, with him, that's Beardian economics right there. They're both influenced by the Beardian economics school because that's, Bill really pushed that with his advisees. So some overlap there in the way they interpret 20th century American history too. Different, different angles, definitely. Different perspectives. But between weeks we've got some overlap.
and both Westerners or Southwestern.
Yes,
Spent
yes,
considerable time in the Southwest and Westerners. So
right, right.
that's interesting too. But yeah, there is a lot of overlap here, and I am surprised a little bit at how familiar Hawley felt after just reading Woodward.
Right. Yes, I agree. I agree. And the way historians wrote in the 50s and 60s does tend, I mean, Woodward, he's unto his own. But Hawley as well. I mean, it even with all of the information and like we said before, it can be heavy at times. It reads well.
Yeah,
It reads very well.
yeah, and I mean, here's the thing: like this is a book that was begun as a dissertation. And I
Right.
mean, we as historians, and if you guys are going through your comps list right now, you could almost always tell a book that was a dissertation that became a book.
Right.
Woodward's Origins of the New South was not a dissertation. It builds on some of his work in the dissertation, but it wasn't his dissertation. Whereas,
Right.
the New Deal and the Problem of Monopoly was Hawley's dissertation. And so there's just,
Right.
and you get that like the density sometimes.
Right. Right. Because you're trying to pack everything into that dissertation. And that's just not, it doesn't always translate to the monograph.
Right. But I still
Absolutely.
think this is a relatively easy reading monograph. And,
Yeah.
before we really dig into it, one of the things that I really appreciate when I'm reading a good history monograph is like short chapters or chapters that
Yes.
are broken up at least.
Right.
Because,
Right. Very well
very
organized.
well organized. Because you know what? When I'm reading, I rarely have time to say that I'm going to be able to read 100 pages right now. Because if that's the case, then I have to set aside 90 minutes or whatever it is. And I don't always have 90 minutes, but I might have
Right.
20 minutes, which means I can get
Right.
through a chapter. Or at least I can get
Right.
through a section of a
Right.
chapter. And that makes
Right.
reading something like this much easier.
Agreed. Absolutely agree with that.
And so for those of you who
Absolutely.
are developing books, writing your dissertations, short chapters. Don't be afraid of short chapters.
Right. It's helpful.
Make life easier on
It
the
is.
because I don't know about you, Marie, but it's always daunting when I'm staring at a 45-page chapter with no.
And like you said, when you only have pockets of time. And that's true for us. That's true for students going through comps. You only have these little pockets of time. You have to make them count. And if you get halfway through a chapter or a third of the way through a chapter and you have to come back to it, sometimes you almost have to start over. So, absolutely. Shorter chapters or well organized chapters. And he's got it.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's important in this work.
yeah. So this book was written, I think it came out in 1966. So this is
Yes.
15 years after after Woodward, but it's only 25 years, really. The dissertation is only 25-ish years after the kind of the completion of or the New Deal ends and the Second World War begins.
Right.
Which means, we use the 25-year rule often as historians. I mean, that's really when the archives are first just now opening up.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, this is the first major work on the New Deal that gets access to all the archives.
Right. And you already have this budding historiography for the New Deal. So you already have these two schools and these two interpretations of the New Deal developing. But then Hawley does have that access that the other historians, maybe they were there firsthand or they were part of it, but that they don't quite, they don't have that distance that Hawley had. Even though it's just 25 years, they don't have that distance. So if we could dive into some of that early historiography and the two ways that the New Deal was looked at before. Let's do that if you don't.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Well, you brought up the two ways. How would you describe them?
Well, the first is like this liberal or progressive view. So Schlesinger is the big proponent of this. That neither one is arguing that there aren't inconsistencies in policies. Neither one of these, the liberal view, the more conservative view, the revisionist view of the New Deal, neither one's arguing there's not inconsistencies with this policy, because there are. I mean, you cannot look at the New Deal coalition and all of the pieces in this coalition without automatically seeing these inconsistencies. But the Schlesinger school, he's arguing that it's successful, that FDR is working on, he's looking at social justice or social programs, labor rights, regulation. And so it may seem inconsistent, but it's really a triumph of reform overall.
And the triumph of Roosevelt.
And so you've got... Exactly. It is Roosevelt's triumph. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then with this other school, you've got, again, the New Deal's inconsistent. It contradicts. It is, some argue in the school that it's economically damaging, that it actually prolongs the Depression. And Hawley addresses the recession within the Depression as well. But that's what the school is arguing, that it prolongs it and it makes it worse. And only with World War II does the Depression actually end, and that has nothing to do with Roosevelt.
Right.
And so it either not enough government intervention or way too much government intervention. And that the inconsistencies still on Roosevelt, but because Roosevelt couldn't get it straight. They talk about this muddled mind that Roosevelt had. And so you have these two schools that he's looking at, and then Hawley comes in. And what is Hawley saying with all of this? How does he fit into this historiography?
I mean, Hawley is not a part of either one of those schools.
Exactly.
He's not. He's resetting the agenda on the New Deal. So one of the things about the writing up until Hawley is so much of it was, the New Deal affected politics at the national level for the next generation, right?
Yes.
Ultimately, arguments in the 1950s and the 1960s was still kind of a relitigation of the New Deal. Was it good? Was it bad? And so you've got people like Schlesinger who are arch proponents of it. They're arch Democrats. They want to protect the legacy of the New Deal. They're promoting the New Deal. And then, in 1964, while Hawley's certainly writing his dissertation, and maybe the dissertation was already published or some defended, I'm not sure, but is the election of Lyndon Johnson on the Great Society platform, which was absolutely presented as a continuation of the New Deal. And so
right.
If you're Lyndon Johnson, you don't present it as a continuation of the New Deal unless you think the New Deal was a good thing.
Right. Which he absolutely did. Built his career on
right.
the New Deal.
So, this is the political zeitgeist of the 1960s is still kind of a relitigation of the New Deal. And it really won't be until maybe the 1970s with stagflation, the end of the liberal consensus, Vietnam, these other various things that will kind of change. But this is before Vietnam, really. Right. Hawley's writing in the midst of, publishing in the midst of it, but he's writing and researching before it. And so it's the end of an old age, And so the time is right to fully reshuffle how people are considering the New Deal, to move it away from maybe the politics of the moment and bring it towards more of this scholarly analysis of the New Deal.
Right. Right. And Johnson's overseeing this huge fracture in the New Deal coalition with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. I mean, he knows he's going to lose the South, which is such a vital piece of this coalition. So, you've got Hawley looking at the creation of the New Deal and the inconsistencies of these policies. And then he's living through the breakup of that coalition and writing during the breakup, the beginning of the breakup of that coalition. So I think that, I don't see how that couldn't have affected the way he looked at these things. And I think knowing that context is really interesting when looking at this book as a whole as well.
Right. And also, we should also mention that, like, there's about to be a very different take on the New Deal that's going to come right after Hawley, that will come from the New Left historians, that are essentially that the New Deal was very conservative. It didn't go anywhere near far enough. And, but that's not really out there when Hawley's writing yet. Right. So Hawley's not really addressing that criticism. That will come in, like, really in the next 2 or 3 years, I think. Historians around, like, Howard Zinn and a few others will advance that. But so this is still in, he's writing this and publishing this in the midst of, was the New Deal good, or was it too much?
Right.
Or was the New Deal necessary, perhaps? And was the New Deal necessary to recovery, or was it a barrier to recovery? I think that's really the question that was being advanced earlier.
Right. That's within the debate. That's what he's looking at. That's the debate of his time. Absolutely.
Right. And he kind of concludes somewhere in the middle. Like, some stuff.
I think that's, yeah.
Some stuff was kind of good. Some stuff was probably not helpful. Some stuff was actively harmful. But what's really important to Hawley, what I think is of critical importance, is that this is not coherent.
Right.
The New Deal was not coherent. And
right.
It's that there may be some consistencies in, like, instinct throughout it, and there may be some consistencies of, like, perspective, but that the actual policy program is entirely incoherent. It's opportunistic, and in fact, I would argue it's more opportunistic than Hawley makes it out to be. Hawley does try to.
Yes.
Hawley actually tries to draw some coherent boundaries and borders around what's going on. I'm not even sure it's that coherent.
Right. Right. And he says this incoherence is politically necessary. Right? That he's trying to make sense of these policies, and he does fall somewhere in the middle between these two schools, that it's not just a liberal victory. They're not just focusing on, the working class, or this, what Roosevelt sees as his new coalition. They're focusing on big business, and in some ways it doesn't go far enough. Right? And so but he says these inconsistencies are politically necessary. You do not get these programs passed, for better or worse, if you're not playing to both sides of this coalition.
Right.
Or all sides of this coalition.
And I think the other, one of the things is that emerges out of this is there's no good guys and bad guys in this work. Everybody is both good and bad. Right. Nobody has a monopoly.
Right. No value judgment.
Yeah, nobody has a monopoly on virtue. Nobody has a monopoly on wisdom. And so that's, I think, one of the most compelling aspects of this. This is not Schlesinger's FDR hero narrative. Right. But nor is it the alternative where FDR is some, like, demon. Right. It's everybody is a little virtuous, a little not so virtuous, and everybody is mostly wrong.
Right. Well, coming back to that idea of being opportunistic, that's what we see here. Even if he doesn't lay it out quite as overtly, it's there. And that's what we see people building on later in his scholarship, that this is very politically opportunistic.
Yeah. He makes at one point towards the end, I wish I'd highlighted this quote because I don't have it actually at my fingertips, but he says, it was during the recession of 37, and Roosevelt, and he says, Roosevelt was of two minds on this, right? And it's like, which wasn't good economically, but was probably necessary politically.
Right. Yes. Yes. And I remember seeing that quote as well, and I actually may have it somewhere, but if we get to it later, I'll read it. But that idea that he does acknowledge it is a political necessity, and probably better overall that he was able to have those two minds, even if there's no coherent economic strategy.
Right. Anyway, so we've talked about the sides. It's probably worth delving into how Hawley sees the various factions of the New Deal. Actually, before we even get into that, most of this book is about the NRA.
Right.
And I mean,
Right.
in the title, he talks about monopoly. And, it's probably worth actually, why does he talk about monopoly? What's he talking about when he's referring to monopoly? And
Right. Do you want to expand on that and talk about the NRA?
sure, I'll talk about monopoly first. He, he uses monopoly as his framing of this because I think he assumes that all of the reformers within the New Deal are trying to either harness monopoly or rage against monopoly. And they believe that monopoly, good or bad, either not enough monopoly or too much monopoly in various people's minds, is at the heart of the cause of the Depression. And so he uses monopoly as his framing because even though we might not always, like, if we were presented with this issue in 2026, we might not say monopoly. What does this have to do with monopoly? To thinkers in the 1930s and to political officials, it was largely a question of monopoly, according to Hawley. And this is so for many people, the Depression was you'll hear this if you're a student of the Depression, you'll know there's a lot of people who blame the Depression on too much competition. Competition was leading to drops in prices, which was affecting which was affecting people's ability to produce, which was causing people to contract the economy. Meanwhile, there were others who argued that the cause of the Depression was too much monopoly, and it was this special interests that was at the center of it, that were constraining and restraining the economy for their own purposes. And so he uses this framing of monopoly as the linchpin of the book, and how people considered their perspective on monopoly kind of defined what camp they would be in throughout the New Deal. And he particularly focuses on the NRA, which I think is a wise choice, given that he's focused on monopoly. Most people listening to this probably know what the NRA was, but it's probably worth going into. It was one of the signature reforms of the early New Deal, where the government encouraged industries to establish their own codes, their industrial codes, which would essentially allow them to control prices. It would allow them to control competition. However, in return, they were expected to make sure that labor prices were high. And there's Section 7, subsection A of the NRA allows for the establishment of a major labor aspect of the NRA. And so it's this idea that what you're going to have is you're going to have business, government, and labor all at the table together, and they're going to establish like what the right prices are. How many jobs do you need? And at what wages should we pay those jobs? And therefore, at what price should we actually charge? Should the goods be charged at in order to allow those wages? How much profit is too much, right? And so what it ends up creating is a government-sponsored system of cartels, where each industry has several big companies that are a part of it, and they're all cooperating with each other with government's, assent in order to control those markets. And there's hundreds of codes, right? And so the NRA is a signature piece of legislation of the first part of the New Deal. Ultimately, it is invalidated by the Supreme Court in the Schechter Poultry case. We're still operating in the Lochner era of the Supreme Court. Whether it would have be found to have been unconstitutional 5 years later is an interesting legal question, but it's found to be unconstitutional, and essentially it's found to be unconstitutional on the price setting premise. And Charles Evans Hughes, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he comes out and gives an absolute, he issues the majority opinion. And Charles Evans Hughes, he was Secretary of State under Harding. He'd been the Republican candidate for president in 1916, and were it not for California, he might have been president. He issues an absolutely blistering rebuke on the NRA and why it's unconstitutional. Unlike the AAA, which is also found unconstitutional in the Butler decision, the NRA never comes back from the dead. People try to reconstitute aspects of it, but it is dead. And Roosevelt doesn't really lift a finger to bring it back either, which is interesting because he works really hard to bring the AAA back. And that's not really a part of this book, but it's interesting how after Schechter, Roosevelt kind of let sleeping dogs lie.
Right. Well, he's already got this anti-business opposition forming against him by the time the Supreme Court knocks down the NRA, where farmers are still very much an important part of that coalition. So he's still got to appeal to farmers and landowners, and the big business, they're kind of making their own bed with Roosevelt in that they don't have, they are turning against him, even with what he is proposing in the NRA that allows them to have power over the economy. Within this act, but have power over the economy. And so he doesn't have as much political reason for pushing for the NRA to come back as he does the AAA.
Right. Now, but what's also interesting is that, this is a three-corner battle, the way that Hawley sets it up. It's a three-corner battle inside of the NRA. And Roosevelt could have abandoned the business, what Hawley sometimes refers to as the business commonwealthman side of it, which were those who believed that business should be allowed to regulate itself, but it should be allowed to regulate an industry, right? That essentially business should be allowed to cartelize. And that was necessary in an industrial economy in order to both preserve, for economic growth and also to ensure stability. They're the ones who tend to move away from Roosevelt by 34 and 35 and start forming these opposition to Roosevelt. Their opposition, according to Hawley at least, is very cynical. It's not, their opposition is not that, well, we tried cartels and it turns out we don't like cartels. Their opposition was mostly, you're trying to intervene in the cartels too much. And we shouldn't have to have labor involved in this.
And that's a big part of that.
These cartels are not cartelly enough. We don't have enough control over it. And that the government and labor are the obstacle to recovery. And if only we are allowed to further cartelize and further control every aspect of the industry, then recovery will fall.
Right. And having labor at the table and labor thought that they could get quite a bit out of this. And the labor movement is growing and becoming more political and more powerful. And so having to sit down with these labor leaders was a part of pushing business out, even as they were benefiting.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is that, that was sort of the necessary, I think, or the compromise that Roosevelt saw here, was that, listen, you're going to get to essentially cartelize. You're going to get everything you
Right.
want. However, you have to make sure, but we're going to put labor at the table with you, if for no other reason that we want to have some opposition at that table. Right? And it creates this like counter movement. And I think Hawley describes it as a counter movement, where there is this tension at the table. And government is kind of is sort of the arbiter in many ways.
Right. Right.
But I'm going to just step back here a second. Because I really want to go into that further, but I do want to keep time here. I mentioned that this three corner fight over monopoly, and I think it's probably worth laying out what the factions actually are. Hawley takes it back to the 1912 election, in that there are, at least for two of the sides of it, he argues that within the Roosevelt coalition, there are the New Nationalists, which were those who were around Teddy Roosevelt in 2012 in the Bull Moose Party, and those who supported Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom. And this was two arguably progressive approaches to dealing with an industrializing economy and this new corporate economy, while also retaining the democratic ideals of the nation. And so Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalists was a lot more comfortable with big business. They saw sort of this paternalist approach, where big business could be harnessed to do the democratic will, with a government that both protected big business and also guided and shepherded big business. Whereas the New Freedom, those around Woodrow Wilson, and in Hawley's mind around Louis Brandeis as well, believed that the problem was there was too much big business, and government's job was to destroy big business and to bring economic power back to the small merchant, right? And so this is the anti-monopoly progressive wing versus the pro-monopoly monopoly wing of the New Nationalists. And Hawley argues they are both a big part of Roosevelt's coalition, for reasons of the 1920s and the early Great Depression, which we don't really have time to get into. Maybe we'll get into with another book sometime. And becoming a part of Roosevelt's massive coalition in 1932 that he wins with. But
Right.
there's another corner inside the administration. And these are this is the corner that's typically been associated with Roosevelt's quote unquote brain trust, many of whom were kind of around Columbia University, people like Adolf Berle and a few others. They were inspired by Thorstein Veblen. And Thorstein Veblen was an early 20th century economist, probably one of the three most important American economists of the early 20th century. And Thorstein Veblen, he believed that an industrial economy could only be made to work within democratic principles if government planned the corporate economy for them. And
Right.
Thorstein Veblen is the guy who coins the term technocracy. He writes a book called Engineers and the Price System in 1920, and this is sort of the Bible for these, who become the technocrats, the brain aspects of the brain trust, where he believed that we don't need financiers running the economy. We don't need capitalists running the economy. We need engineers running the economy. We need people who are going to build these systems, who are going to look at the economy like a machine and are going to build the perfect machine possible. And it's only government planning that can do that. I think there's this notion, because Thorstein Veblen as an economist has kind of been forgotten, I think, even by many scholars. And if he is remembered, it's for the notion of conspicuous consumption, which is from a book earlier in the 20th century, that people associate the New Deal with Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. And I don't think that's right. And I don't think Hawley thinks that's right. Hawley is very, Keynes is referred to a couple of times, but he really doesn't make an appearance till almost the end of the New Deal.
Right.
Certainly not in the NRA era. And in the NRA era, Thorstein Veblen is a far more consequential economist. And his ideas will go across the Atlantic and will form a major component of what's called the Beveridge Report in England during the Second World War, and where the Albert Beveridge. There's two major beverages in history, and I'm drawing a blank of which one's which. One is the imperialist senator from Indiana, and one is the British economist. But Beveridge, the British economist, argues that we need government planning at a massive level in order to ensure we don't have another Great Depression. And if you take a look at like Hayek's work, he's challenging Beveridge in this notion of planning that goes back to Veblen. It's not really a criticism of Keynes. It's more a criticism of Veblen through Beveridge, which I think is really interesting, that you look at the NRA through the lens of Veblen, and it becomes a much different animal than looking at it through the lens of Keynes. And that's what Hawley does here.
Right. That regulation.
It's beyond regulation. It's planning. It's where you're going to have bureaucrats setting how many employees you can have, what price you can charge for it. They disagree with the New Nationalists. They disagree with the people who like the cartel. Their disagreement is not in theory. They want things more planned. They want things more stable. Their disagreement is over who gets to do the planning.
Right.
They want government bureaucrats to do the planning. They don't want businessmen to do the planning. Whereas the business Commonwealthmen or the New Nationalists want planning, but they want businessmen to do the planning. Right. Sorry, I do have the
and they want to choose who's involved in those discussions.
Sorry, say that again.
The business leaders want to decide, they want to do the planning, and they want to decide who's going to be involved in those discussions. And the government knows, like the bureaucrats know, well, we need to bring other people to the table here. And that's why we will do this better.
Right. In fact, they don't even think they need to bring other people to the table. They just want themselves driving the bus. They just think they can accommodate everybody else's interests in a way that the businessmen can't, even if they're not actually going to ask people what those interests are. But they are...
True. Yes, that's very true, yeah.
So... so those are, and then the third, I think I mentioned that the third corner are the old the old Democratic Party at this point. The antitrusters is how Hawley refers to them. But these are people who want the government to intervene in order to break up big companies, in order to bring back competition, not to restrict competition, but to restore competition. And this was at the center of at least the first 2/3 of Wilson's presidency before the First World War. And so this is the Democratic Party's, this is the legacy of the Democratic Party before, in the late 1920s, the Democratic Party has some radical shifts, particularly in the Northeast and the West. And many people who had hence, heretofore been Republicans jump in with Roosevelt. And you've got this much larger, unwieldy coalition. So that's the three-corner debate within the NRA, according to Hawley.
Yes. And that was an excellent description of that. That was excellent. I think you hit all of the major points of that. The three corners, the NRA, the entire debate. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Just to, again, the key is, or one of the aspects of the NRA is that at least early in the New Deal, according to Hawley, the antitrusters have virtually no say. That they are brought on board to the NRA through rhetoric alone. That that everybody has essentially realized that The American people don't really want planning, whether it's done by bureaucrats or whether it's done by cartels or like the businessmen. The American people really want the restoration of competition, but the people in power think that that's really bad for the American people. And so what they end
Right.
up doing is they end up mixing, or they end up kind of out of necessity, they end up kind of going with the business commonwealthman plan, this cartel plan in the NRA, although with a big seat for labor. And again, that's a consequence of the of one wing of the Democratic Party. And the planners are kind of the government planners, the Veblenite, the technocrats are brought along with that because I think they believe they're going to have a great deal of say in this creation of all of these codes, and they bring the antitrusters along, at least according to Hawley, through rhetoric alone. They keep saying we're doing this for the small businessmen, we're doing this to restore competition, even though what they're doing is restricting competition.
Yes, and he does talk about rhetoric a lot. And he does talk about how the government and the planners use that rhetoric and use these new terms to, in a way, like you're saying, to bring the antitrusters along, to bring business along, and to convince the American people this isn't overreach, right? This isn't government planning, even though it obviously is. But the rhetoric matters, and I did like that Holly brought that out. I'm glad you said something about that. But he is arguing that rhetoric does matter quite a bit in the NRA and in this whole process.
Yeah, and then ultimately it's a political process, and this is
Absolutely.
you're seeing Roosevelt the politician, and
Right. Absolutely.
while Hawley might disagree with Schlesinger's Jupiterian image of Franklin Roosevelt, or Olympian maybe, he would never argue that Roosevelt's not a great politician, because Roosevelt is a great politician.
No. Yes. Yes. And he absolutely acknowledges that. Absolutely.
So where do we want to go next, Marie? Now that we've set up
Well,
the...
I know that we're kind of running close to time, but I think we have to talk about what this idea of American economic ambivalence means, because I do love this. I love this idea he presents, and I think it's at the heart of this inconsistency that we see in New Deal policies in general, but the NRA and the ones he's talking about specifically as well. So when he's talking about this, what is he trying to say about the American people?
Oh, I think that they have no idea what they want.
Yes, exactly.
They have no idea what
They
they want.
want it all.
They want it all.
They want it both ways. They want competition and lower prices, but they want protection from a depression, right? So they want a little of both. And I think that is at the heart of this, that Roosevelt ultimately either inherently knows this, subconsciously understands this, and he tries to give them both. Rhetorically, he tries to give them both through this legislation, through the executive action. And that's the inconsistencies
Yeah.
that the other historians are trying to piece together, is how can this all work? But it's the American people themselves pushing this.
Right. There's a great old Simpsons scene where they do a focus group of children, and it's like they're trying to figure out like a TV show that kids would like, and they said, "Hold on, so let me get this straight. You guys want a gritty, realistic show with space robots and magic?"
Right, exactly. That's what the American people want. They want it all. They want it both ways. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, and the New Deal, according to Hawley, that's it's trying to accommodate everybody and trying to accommodate and pleasing nobody, but hopefully using rhetoric to hold the whole thing together.
Right.
That kind of does it. And so, Marie, what do you think is Hawley's take on whether it works? Does the New Deal work?
I mean, like we said before, he comes down in between those schools where pieces of it work, but ultimately, does it end the depression? I mean, he talks about the recession quite a bit throughout this, And so it doesn't work exactly the way it was intended, but Roosevelt does hold that coalition together.
Yeah, he does. And I mean, I think what the sort of, I'm going to use a game theory term here, the Nash equilibrium that Hawley describes, that, you know, the only thing that they can end up doing is spending money, because they can't actually decide on a program, because they end up being at a point where,
Right.
especially, agriculture is different, and Hawley makes that very clear. Agriculture is a different animal, and this is
Yes.
not a book about agriculture. And I'll be honest, my
No.
understanding of the New Deal is mostly through the ag. It's not through the
Right.
NRA. So, my impression is of the scholar of the AAA, not the NRA, and not the industrial side of things.
Right.
And this book is about the industrial side of things.
Mm-hmm.
But that after the NRA gets blown up, and after the big businessmen cartel, arguably the ones that the business commonwealthmen flee the New Deal coalition, become Republicans again, which is where they'd almost always been before 1928, 1929, before the Hoover administration. They return home, and they make a useful target, political target, especially the 1936 election. But the economic planners don't really survive either. Especially the first wave that were really the Veblenite, the real technocrats, according to Hawley. Now, some of this is because they lose internal political battles. Guys like Ray Moley and a few others lose internal political battles. And on the other hand, I think Roosevelt just decided that they were not politically helpful.
Right. Right.
That it was that there was and so what you end up doing, and this is interesting, is that like the people that end up driving the bus by 1936 post NRA are the original Democrats, are like the New Deal antitrust, are like the antitrusters from the Wilsonian age, the Brandeisians. I guess that's not a surprise that like the party returned to its base, and it was because I think that ultimately that's what the American people preferred, was competition and low prices. And especially once the economy started to, there appeared to be some stability in the economy. They moved out of the crisis of 1932 and 1933, and then you looked across at Soviet Union with 5-year plans and planning, and you looked at Nazi Germany and fascist Italy with their cartels. And although there are many people who found appeal in those things, I think that some of the shine was coming off of those systems too.
Right. I mean, the government had expanded beyond what Americans could have ever thought was possible. By the 36 election, by the time the economy is starting to show at least stability, if not a little bit of improvement, before Roosevelt pulls back on some of those programs. And so seeing these alternatives, these more radical alternatives around the world, and seeing Roosevelt's opponents start to tag him with that, he's got to appeal and kind of calm the American people and say, this is helping you, whether or not it is, that rhetoric, this is helping you, and we're going to roll back as soon as we can. And it doesn't work.
Yeah.
I mean,
and
that's where you get into the recession.
What's really interesting is in the first half of the book, I really felt like Hawley was sort of coming down on the side of the antitrusters. Like that was sort of his preference, was he came down on the side of the antitrusters. In the back half of the book, I'm not so sure. He's very critical of them, and sometimes of their naivete, critical of their of what they thought they could, of their ambition, of what they thought they could accomplish, and critical of themselves of not having worked things out, particularly.
Right.
And so, again, I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, the first half of the book, I was like, okay, Hawley's clearly in the antitruster camp. But in the second half of the book, he's not. And he connects one thing that I thought was interesting is that he connects the antitrust tradition to the agrarian tradition. in
Right.
right, and he's pretty critical of the agrarians. And yeah, so I mean, again, there are no good guys in this book, and that's, I think, what I like about it is there's no real protagonists, no real antagonists. It's just a mess.
It's nuanced. It's very complicated. Exactly. He tells the story as it is. And I think he does a great job of doing that. And I like that you brought up the evolution from the antitrusters to the idea that, well, maybe they're making this, they're at least not helping the situation. And I think that's like the evolution. It shows the evolution of thinking at the time.
Yeah,
So I think he does a really good job convincing you in the first part that they are in the, he doesn't come out and say it necessarily, but they're in the right here. Things change and situations change and they do not change. And so then, because the situation has changed, their ideas are no longer, or shouldn't be dominant, essentially.
yeah. And I mean, I think and this is where Keynes makes the appearance towards the end of the book, is that I think the government, Roosevelt, and is that countercyclical spending is maybe the only thing politically we can do.
Right.
And that
Right. To hold it together.
right, and that kind of, and that does work within the antitrust Brandeisian tradition to some of them, and he draws further distinctions within, there's a hard money group within them, and then a softer money group, but that at least that it's sort of consistent in the second half of the New Deal that Keynes's approach to recovery might be the only one that's politically possible. But that's not till 37, 38. And so this notion of this notion of John Maynard Keynes being a big figure in the early New Deal is not true, at least according to Hawley.
Right. I think, and I buy it. I think he makes an excellent argument. I don't think you can.
I do too. I as a scholar of the New Deal, I've never been totally sure where people, they where some scholars like imagine Keynes, and I'm like, okay, I mean, maybe, but I don't, Veblen is a more prominent figure, and Irving Fisher might have been a more prominent figure if he had not blown his credibility on the eve of the stock market crash in 1929 by saying the stock market will go up forever. But anyway, again, Marie, you mentioned Katznelson earlier, and I think that's a kind of one of the most important, relatively recent books on the New Deal. Now that we've had a good chance to really talk about this book, where do you see the Hawley tradition in Katznelson?
I think with what Katznelson is building on again are the inconsistencies within the New Deal and this idea of something for everyone. He's not necessarily looking at the economy the way that Hawley is, because that's what Hawley looks at. He's coming at it from more of a social angle, but he's still showing these economic policies that the government's passing through this New Deal legislation. They benefit some people, but they purposefully leave out others. And so you have, legislation that helps farmers, that doesn't help sharecroppers. Just the implementation of these policies don't help sharecroppers. They don't help agricultural workers in the West. They don't help domestic laborers, and there's a reason for that. And what Katznelson argues is that's because you've got to keep the Southern vote, and Southerners are not going to vote for this big New Deal legislation if it's going to benefit if it's going to push back against Jim Crow, or if it's going to benefit Southerners or people of color. And so they have these concessions. They force these concessions from the more liberal branch of the Democratic Party and from Roosevelt, and they get those concessions. Well, that right there, those racial concessions are showing the beginning, that's the cracks. That's not sustainable in a political coalition, even though there's realignment. I mean, we cannot deny there is absolutely realignment, and you do have a New Deal coalition that lasts for decades. But from the very beginning, Katznelson argues that it's kind of poisoned. It's this deal that they make that the death of the coalition is right there. And I think Hawley shows that through this idea between business and labor wanting separate things, and what they want is not compatible, but they're both part, at least initially. I mean, again, he's getting through part of the second term where Katznelson is going farther, but these are both pieces of the coalition that Roosevelt's trying to hold together, and ultimately he sides with labor and business leaves him, whether, whichever comes first. But it's still this idea that this coalition is not sustainable from either through economic or social policies.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, this is, we're talking political history here, and anytime somebody's elected with a really big coalition, it's always going to be a little unwieldy.
Yeah.
And
and it's incredible that Roosevelt could hold it together as long as he did.
Well, he was assisted by an absolutely inept Republican Party.
Right. Right.
That struggled to attract, and a lot of nice things can be said about Alf Landon, lots of nice things can be said about Wendell Willkie and many prominent Republicans of that era, but the Hoover years really discredited the Republican Party, and they never really were able to articulate an attractive alternative to the New Deal that they could all agree on, because there's huge divisions among them.
Absolutely.
But what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting here is there's very little talk of the South in Hawley's book.
Right.
Almost none, in fact.
Right, that's not what he's looking at, right?
Right.
He's looking at the industrial Northeast, and
right.
I guess you could argue part of the Midwest, but mostly the Northeast.
Right, and also no discussion of a conservative coalition.
Yes, right. He's not looking at that either.
Now, this is not really a book about Congress, but he doesn't ignore Congress.
Right.
And it's just interesting that there's no. He doesn't mention anything about a conservative coalition. And there's
right, and it's there. It's starting.
Yeah. Right? And there's not really any discussion of the South, because, and again, I mean, your point's obvious, is that this is not a book about the South. It's mostly a book about the Northeast and the Midwest. But those Southern votes are necessary in Congress. And there's a lot of Southerners in the administration. This is a Democratic administration, after all.
Right.
But anyway, I thought I thought that was interesting. Any final thoughts or questions? We're coming up against the hour, but we can go a little more than that. I've got some time, so if we want to go, we can go a little.
The last question I was going to end with was just like your favorite part of the book, or your favorite part of the argument that he makes, or what you find most useful. And I'll start. In his conclusion, he has this wonderful quote from Dorothy Thompson in 1938 about the two souls, that there are two souls embedded in the bosom of the administration, as there are in the American people. And so essentially showing here, Roosevelt, to keep the coalition together, to be reelected, to do as much as he did, he had to keep that in mind always. He always had to keep in mind that Americans want it both ways. And I love looking at politics from the ground up and looking how voters shape legislation, because we look at these huge figures, and Roosevelt absolutely was. And his charisma and his political prowess absolutely get a lot of this through. But if voters don't support him in the midterms, and they take Congress, get rid of the Democratic majority he doesn't get to do any of the rest of it. So he has to respond to voters to an extent, especially during his second term, which he does. And so I love looking at how the ideas of the American people are pushing this massive change in the federal government, even as they're not quite sure about it. Even as the American people themselves haven't quite wrapped their minds completely around the idea of this expansive bureaucracy necessary to give them what they want. And so I really like this idea of the two souls of the administration and of the American people. So I think that's what tied it together for me, is that quote.
I love that. Yeah, that's fantastic. You're right. I mean, it's so, I read that, but I didn't quite pick up on how profound it was. That's yeah. For me, the real use, there's the value of the book for me personally, and then there's the stuff that I loved about it. The stuff that I love about the book is that I typically assume that governments don't engage in economic policy with grand strategies, or that like they may have strategies, but what's the old expression, that it doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. And it's a so it's always a mess, and governments have to maintain the people on their side, and the people, as you've been, don't know what they want, and so it is messy. Policy making is messy. It's never clean. And when you try to kind of, as a scholar, it's easy to do this, and I do it myself, so make this mistake a lot, is that I see the consequence of a policy and I project on what must have led to that policy, as opposed to recognizing that it came out of probably a really difficult political process, with a lot of
Right.
compromises, and that the eventual policy probably looks nothing like how it was initially envisioned.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but and then also the unintended consequences. I, love that. The
Yes.
the
Yes.
most useful to me is I thought his three-cornered factional division of the New Deal was really useful. I have my own three-quarter division of the AG, of the AAA, and it overlaps pretty well, actually. So
Yeah.
that both made me real. It did two things for me. First of all, it said, "Oh, maybe I'm onto something," but secondly, it said, "Maybe you should have reread Hawley."
Right. Right. Which you've done
Now I'm
now.
done, right? Unfortunately, I haven't written the book yet,
Yes. Yes.
so I've got time to fix it.
Exactly. You can incorporate some of this. Absolutely.
So yeah,
Absolutely.
and yeah. Anyway, that I it's a great book, and
I agree.
if you're interested in the New Deal, or if you're doing work on the New Deal, read it. We didn't scratch the
Mm-hmm.
surface. We barely scratched the surface of this book.
No, I mean, he shows you how the sausage is made. He takes you behind the scenes in this. So you're talking about policy making. If you want to see how that's done, read it.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
very good.
And but hopefully for those of you who are not doing New Deal, or who are not necessarily and even if you are, that you enjoyed this podcast. And Marie, do you want to give a little bit of a preview of what we're doing next time?
We are doing Hofstadter's Ideas of the Party System next time. So again, we've just got these foundational texts going, and I think we're probably going to keep that up for a little while. But we are going to look at, one of the biggest names in political history next week.
Yep. And I've never read this book.
Oh, I haven't read it since I comped, but it was on my comps list. Huge part of it. I'm looking forward to rereading it. It's not it's not a hard read. I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about this.
Well, I can't wait. Anyway, thank you very much, Marie, for braving the cold.
Thank you.
And
Yes, thank you.
we'll see you all again next time.